Hi everyone, my name is Matt and I'm a grad student at the University of Washington. Today I'm here to talk to you about some work my collaborators and I conducted called Network Capacity as Common Pool Resource, Community-Based Congestion Management in a Community Network. So what do we mean by congestion management? This is specifically at the human level, answering the question who uses network resources and how much do they use. There was extensive work in the 90s and early aughts on internet pricing. And while pricing works in many contexts, it's not appropriate for use in all contexts. And so we ask, are there alternatives to pricing for congestion management in internet networks? In fact, McKee, Mason, and Varian, some of the seminal authors in the pricing literature, note as an aside, there are many ways to deal with congestion externalities. One way is to establish social norms that penalize inappropriate behavior. Such norms can work well in small groups where there is repeated interaction, but they often do not scale well to a system of millions of users. This quote is really revealing because it shows this implicit assumption of scale, and the scale is actually not true in the places where my lab and I work. Specifically, we work in community networks, and community networks change the trade-off space relative to traditional large commercial networks. Community networks are able to leverage local capability, like local operators, existing land, existing power, and importantly, existing social infrastructures to operate more efficiently and with less overhead. Because of this local responsibility, though, sometimes this does come at the cost of less professionalization in the network, and so there are trade-offs. So what do community networks have to do with common pool resources? Common pool resources are this economic concept of large-scale resources like fisheries, watersheds, or common grazing land, which can be drawn sustainably up to some rate, but are vulnerable to overuse. So interestingly, managing common pool resources is fairly difficult. Fortunately, there's been tons of research into this area, and in fact, a set of well-established principles originally formalized by Eleanor Ostrom for how communities can come together to manage common pool resources without resorting to privatization and pricing or heavy top-down regulation and extensive rules. So we were curious, can we apply these principles directly for network resource management in these community scale networks? To explore this question, my collaborators and I conducted a study in partnership with Rhizomatica, a nonprofit operating community cellular networks in Oaxaca, Mexico. Drawing from value-sensitive design and participatory design, we conducted 3 public workshops and a series of interviews in a community called Inés. After the workshops and interviews, we generated transcripts, coded them, and iteratively grouped our codes into prevailing themes. The context in Inés is important for understanding our results. Inés is a small rural community surrounded by sharp hills in a remote region of Oaxaca. There are around 1,000 residents, and the economy is primarily agricultural. While this work centers around internet access and a trial of a new LTE-based community cellular network, Inés has existing experience operating a voice and SMS-only 2G cellular network in partnership with Rhizomatica. The residents in Inés also manage other infrastructure like water and power communally and have existing social structures for doing so. Before we go on, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge my positionality as a researcher in this domain. I have a very different lived experience in what it means for internet access to be affordable, convenient, and justly allocated than the participants of this study. Our first finding is that, as we suspected, pricing is not appropriate in this context. Our participants indicated that because the community cellular network was supported by the local government and was making use of commonly held land and power infrastructure, that it need to be operated communally, like the existing water and power infrastructures. In this context, communal goods need to serve all according to their need and not necessarily their wealth. So prepaid pricing schemes that are really common with small-scale community networks, or small subscriptions with different speed plans for different users, were not acceptable. There's a subtle, important distinction in Inés between paying for additional capacity, which is okay, versus cutting in line for some kind of fixed resource, which was not okay. Our second finding is that prioritization of certain tasks in the network was very important to the participants. Participants almost universally wanted to prioritize person-to-person communications over things like entertainment or video. So these are things like voice calls and SMS, but also things like modern messaging apps like Signal, Messenger, or WhatsApp. Importantly, though, participants said that any prioritization or shaping needed to apply uniformly across all users, so there was no special treatment in the network. Our third finding is that participants had a very subtle view about the trade-off between privacy and governance of the community network. They indicated that it was important to hold data to support dispute resolution at a monthly community meeting, but that the data needed to be held minimally and arrived at the number of 2 months. Key stakeholders in the community also wanted to see specific site and service usage across the entire community to be able to tell how the resource was being used and determine if it was worth it for the community to invest more in improving it or not. Community members also wanted to see total usage for each individual using the network to be able to find and identify overusers and help make sure the network was being used fairly. But it was important to participants that whatever management infrastructure was provided would never store disaggregated individual data. So they didn't want to be able to have someone see which sites particular users were visiting. Lastly, the participants felt it was very important that the management infrastructure should support a local human administrator in the network. This person would be responsible for managing the network, and this maps to existing social structures for the 2G cellular network, water, and power infrastructure. This local admin would be responsible for making the prioritization and allocation decisions, importantly taking into account the out-of-band context that would be hard to capture technologically. This local admin would be responsible for assessing network's health and reporting to the town government and assembly, but again, as related to the previous finding, it was important that this local administrator not have any detailed information beyond the minimum necessary to undertake their duties. So how does all this relate back to Ostrom's principles for managing common pool resources? When we look at Ostrom's principles, we find 5 clearly have implications for the development of technologies supporting community networks. Firstly, the principle of clearly defined boundaries has implications for how we manage users in the network. Boundaries need to be set, but also need to be controllable by the local users in the network. Regarding congruence between appropriation and provision rules and local conditions, we find that rules must be adaptable and not hard-coded. And this maps with the desires of our workshop and interview participants. Regarding monitoring, it's really important that community network technologies balance individual privacy with collective understanding. And lastly, regarding graduated sanctions and conflict resolution mechanisms, it's important that any kind of local administrator or manager be able to apply sanctions in a way that can be audited and contested outside the network with existing social structures. Our initial results do support that Ostrom's Common Pool Resource governance principles are compatible with the values of the users in Senthi and this. But we find that when surveying existing tools, that most of them fall short in supporting this mode of operation. Specifically, tools targeting professional ISPs offer sophisticated flow control and optimization primitives that can be used to prioritize different types of traffic, and they integrate well with network equipment for automation. But they have a high barrier to entry, and they offer intrusive logging capabilities that expose this detailed individual data that's so problematic. They also assume an asymmetric power relationship between the operator and the user, and they don't provide a way for end users to resolve conflicts with the operator. The operator is always right. On the other end of the spectrum, consumer and home-targeted tools have a low usability threshold and the low cost, which is great, but they don't integrate with commercial-grade equipment to enforce boundaries to the common pool resource, and they also gather and make visible too much data about individuals because they assume that everyone is in the same trust circle. In conclusion, we find there's an underexplored middle ground between large-scale ISP networks and home and consumer networks, where community networks fit in. There's a fundamentally different relationship between operators and users in community networks than is modeled in existing tools. Thanks for your attention, and if you found this talk interesting or would like to discuss anything beyond the Q&A, please reach out. My information's on the slide.